The two certainties in life, according to Benjamin Franklin anyway, are, if you know them, what are they? Death and taxes. That's what Benjamin Franklin said anyway. In a personal letter to Jean-Baptiste Leroy, which if your name is Jean-Baptiste Leroy, you have to say it at least with a hint of a French accent. Otherwise, it doesn't sound like anything right. So, Jean-Baptiste Leroy, Franklin wrote to him and he said this, quote, "Our new Constitution is now established and has an appearance that promises permanency. But in this world, nothing can be certain except death and taxes." Right? Now, that sentiment does not appear to be original to Benjamin Franklin. There's a character named Christopher Bullock, who was an author in his work called The Cobbler of Preston. He gave us an earlier version of that saying when he wrote this, quote, "'Tis impossible to be sure of anything but death and taxes." So, our text this morning, as we get into Matthew chapter 17, we finish up Matthew chapter 17, has these two subjects in it. So let's read our text, starting in verse 22 through the end of the chapter. As they were gathering in Galilee, they would be Jesus and his disciples. As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And he will be raised on the third day." And they were greatly distressed. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" And he said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Right? Now, this is an interesting text, as everyone is. We come to this as students. We come to this portion of the Bible as students, and we want to know, of course, what does this text say, and what does it mean, and how do we apply it? And when we look at this, we think, okay, well, it's about Jesus' death, and it's about taxes. But what about, why is that here? Why does Matthew place these two scenarios? If we're tracking with Matthew's gospel, we know that this is now the second time that Jesus has made this prediction of his suffering, death, and resurrection. So why does he do it a second time, and why does he place it here? And what's the connection between his prediction of his suffering, death, and resurrection and this whole thing with the 2 drachma tax and Jesus satisfying it miraculously with Peter going on this little fishing expedition? The point of the text is not, if you owe taxes, go fishing. That can't be it, right? So what's the connection here? We know they're not just random facts. Matthew is obviously, he's a very intelligent writer, but he's more than that, inspired by the Holy Spirit, led by the Holy Spirit to put together this gospel narrative so that we could know who Jesus is and what he's done on our behalf. So why does he include these things here? And unless we know, it's not super obvious. So we've got to study this out and figure it out, right? And so they're not just random facts. He's carefully placed these 2 scenarios with the subjects of death and taxes in this narrative to help us understand that everything has to be weighed against the main thing. And that's our big idea this morning. Everything is to be weighed against the main thing. And I want that to get in us. What we're going to find is we'll make some application this morning, but if we can get this in us, it will grow us in our faith, and we will find us applying this to our lives possibly on a daily basis. So I want us to say it together. Everything is to be weighed against the main thing. Now, not just 5 of us, let's all say it together. Everything is to be weighed against the main thing. Now, I want to set the table here and make sure that we're able to take it all in. And there's two other sayings that are recorded in the Gospels that I want us to keep in mind here in order to rightly interpret and rightly understand what's taking place in this text. The first one comes out of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, which of course we studied months and months ago. Verse 17, it's Jesus talking, and he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So clearly, Jesus says, I have come to fulfill, not to do away with the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them or to fully satisfy them and so render them unemployed, right? So he's come for that purpose. The other one comes from Mark chapter 10, where Jesus says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So again, here Jesus tells us why he's come. He's come to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, what we have to grasp here, as again, if we're going to understand this rightly, is keeping these two statements in mind and making sure we're understanding what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying that he's come for a distinct purpose. First, in the first verse that we looked at, it is to fulfill the law and the prophets, to fulfill all of the promises, all that was portrayed in the Old Testament symbolically. Jesus is fulfilling actually, and not just temporarily as it was in the Old Testament, but permanently as it is under the New Covenant or the New Testament. Okay, so he's come to fulfill the Old Testament promises, and he does so by giving his life as a ransom for many. See how those two tie together? He's come to give his life as a ransom for many, and in giving his life as a ransom for many, he's fulfilling the law and the prophets. So we've got to keep that in mind as we work through our text. So let's go back to this prediction about Jesus' death, these opening two verses, where we find this. Jesus discloses the main thing. Okay, that's point number one. Jesus discloses the main thing. And remember, everything has to be weighed against the main thing. Everything has to be weighed against the main thing. Now, if you're a leadership or management student, you're probably familiar with Stephen Covey. And if you're familiar with Stephen Covey, you're probably familiar with his most famous saying, where he says, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. How many has heard that before, right? That's Stephen Covey. It's like pithy. It's a bit genius. It's memorable. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And it's great as long as you know what the main thing is. But if you don't know what the main thing is, how can you keep the main thing the main thing? It's like you're left kind of a little bit of a scramble. You're kind of left guessing, probably a little bit confused. Thankfully, though, Jesus does not leave us to wonder what the main thing is, right? He tells us, he discloses it right here. According to Jesus, the gospel is the main thing. And I want to qualify that statement because, friends, there's lots of things in life that are important. And we don't want to make light of those things at all. But even though there's lots of things in life that are important, there's not lots of main things. There is the main thing in life, right? And everything has to be weighed against the main thing. And Jesus says that the main thing is the gospel. It is the good news of God's salvation, which was bought and paid for through Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. That's the main thing. And though each of those acts are distinct acts, Jesus suffered, Jesus died, Jesus came back to life. Those are collectively communicated as the gospel, as though they're separate acts, they're communicated as a single act because all of them together are what make the good news the good news. What makes the gospel the good news and what makes it the main thing. Think for a moment, if Jesus suffered but he did not die, then the gospel isn't the main thing because there is no gospel. If he died but he did not come back to life, the job was not yet completed. It's not the gospel either. So according to Jesus, the gospel is the main thing, and everything has to be weighed against the main thing, but we got to know what that main thing is. He suffered, he died, he came back to life. And for you and for me, even though there's lots of important things in life, the gospel is actually the most important thing. And that is because it is by the gospel, by his suffering, death, and resurrection, that Jesus secured our eternal well-being. And without the gospel, we are hopelessly lost in this life and eternally condemned. So friends, even though, you and I probably can think in our lives right now things that are really important. There's things that trouble us, things we're losing sleep over, things that are causing anxiety, things that we just are, they're massive, they're really, really important. But they're not the main thing. And whatever it is that comes to our mind, might be at home, might be with our kids, might be with our parents, might be at work, our neighbors, etc., right? Whatever it is that comes to mind. And throughout our lives, all of those things that we experience that are important, they're not the main thing. The gospel is the main thing, because without the gospel, friends, we're lost. Eternity is at stake with regard to the gospel, right? So Jesus discloses what the main thing is, and the main thing is the gospel. And understanding that, then we have to say everything else in life has to be weighed against the main thing, the gospel. And this disclosure for the disciples was very distressing, right? Look at verse 23. Jesus makes this announcement, and their response, they're greatly distressed. Another translation puts it, they were extremely saddened by this. See, the reality of Christ's mission is now beginning to sink in for the disciples. Initially, you remember the first time that he made this prediction in front of his disciples, Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him and says, "This will never happen to you, Lord." And of course, that's when Jesus puts Peter in his place quite abruptly. But now there's no protest. Now they're not saying no. Now it's starting to sink in, and it's distressing to them. They're extremely saddened by this. And they simply didn't understand yet. Even though they've been walking with Jesus now for over 2 years, seeing who he is, hearing his teachings, watching his miracles, all of those things, even though they've been with him for all of this time now, they did not yet understand what Jesus was going to accomplish through his suffering, death, and resurrection. It's just not, they just haven't grasped it yet. So they don't yet know that the main thing is the main thing, and that's why it's causing them distress. They did not know yet, they didn't comprehend yet that he had to die for our sins in order to rescue us from them. It was a necessity. There was no other way to reconcile us to God. That's what makes it the main thing. But for them, they only have a miniature, partial understanding of what Jesus is going to fully accomplish. And so this is all distressing to them. And before we move on, I want to just make a couple of quick points of application. Because for those of us who have been walking with Jesus for quite some time, we probably recognize this. For those of you that are newer to your faith, you need to know this. You need to grasp this. That is this. That as much as we wish we could, as much as we strive to be able to, you and I will not fully understand what God is doing in this world and in our lives. And a lot of what we see causes great distress. We experience things in our life that we didn't see coming, that we just can't make any sense out of, and so we get distressed by it. And how could we not, right? It just upended us. The rug got pulled out from underneath. We don't know what's going on. We see things out in this world taking place, and it's like, what? This is tough. And we try to understand it, but we don't. And here's what we've got to grasp, that we're not going to understand it, not fully. Sometimes hindsight, we could look back and go, oh, I see what God's doing now. I see what he was doing now. But in the moment, what was our response? Frustration, anger, sadness, fill in the blank, right? And here's what I want to tell you. You're not going to understand it fully. But here's what I'm going to question. I want to challenge you with this question. Knowing that you're not going to understand everything that God is doing in this life and in your life, will you love him anyway? Will you trust him anyway? Will you serve him anyway? Because for those of us who've walked with Jesus for a time, we probably can instantly think of a few people, at least a few people, who experienced something in life that they couldn't make sense out of, and they walked away from their faith. And my prayer is that that wouldn't be any of us, not now or not into the future. See, Jesus discloses to us what the main thing is. And the main thing, friends, the main thing is the gospel. The main thing is our eternal well-being, which was secured by the shed blood of Jesus Christ, his suffering, death, and resurrection. And as long as we know that that's the main thing, then we can weigh everything else in life against that. And we keep our feet under us, right? So when you don't understand, and when you're puzzled, and when you're frustrated, and when you're angry, and when you're saddened, will you love him, trust him, and serve him anyway? Right? The second application that I would like to make for us this morning is that we need to be careful to listen to everything that Jesus has said. It's like these disciples, when I read this, I'm like, it's like they didn't even hear him say, and he will be raised on the third day. Like that was missed by them. Again, like they're selectively hearing. They hear suffering and they hear death, and their response is extreme sadness, but they didn't. I mean, if we've been around the church, if we're familiar with the Bible, we're familiar with this whole subject or context of resurrection, because Jesus rose from the dead. But for these guys, they're not familiar with this. This is like new information for them, and they missed it. Like, how did you miss that? But they must have, because they're greatly distressed. They're extremely saddened by it. And friends, again, everything weighed against the main thing. We have to listen to everything that Jesus has said. We can't just hear suffering and death. We have to hear resurrection as well. We sang it in this song this morning. It starts out about our sin and the sorrow of all of that. And what's going to happen when Jesus steps up and says, I'll pay the price, right? And we think that's great. But the song makes progression all the way into eternity, where he finally says, welcome home. And if we don't remember that he says someday to us, welcome home, well done, good and faithful servant. If we forget that there's an eternity, if we forget that God wins, hands down, if we forget that, friends, we're going to let the things in this life that aren't the main thing, unfortunately, be the main thing, and it's going to sidetrack us. So, quick application, right? It isn't that the everythings in life don't cause frustration and anger and distress and sadness. It isn't that doesn't happen. It's that when we remember what the main thing is, we don't have to remain in that state of disillusionment. We can trust God and love God and serve God anyway, because we know we're not going to understand everything, but we know in the end, Jesus wins, right? And we get to be with him. And so, first thing here, first two verses, this is the death side of the text. We understand what the main thing is. But now we need to see how it ties into this second part. And this is, as usual, it's interesting to me. Like, why is this placed in here? And maybe we'll learn some things here this morning, because here we see now that Peter, Simon, called in our text Simon, it's Simon Peter, he's confronted by a picture of the main thing. So remember what I said. All of the promises and all of the demands and regulations of the Old Testament were temporal and they were symbolic, and they're fulfilled permanently and completely or fully in the person and work of Jesus Christ. So Peter, by these tax collectors coming up to him, he's confronted by a picture or some symbolism of what the main thing is. And we won't understand this text unless we understand what's going on here. So back to verse 24. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Evidently, Jesus walked into town. If you notice the progression of the text, Matthew writes it like this. They come into the region of Galilee. It's a region. Then specifically to the town of Capernaum, which is in Galilee. And then in a few moments, they're going to be in a house at Capernaum in Galilee. So it's like he works from the bigger picture down to the smaller picture. And so here they come into Capernaum, and evidently the tax collectors were there. It's the time of year to collect the tax, and Jesus and his disciples just walk on by. And some of them evidently grab Peter and say, "Hey, doesn't your teacher, does he not pay the tax?" And of course, here's Peter. Boy, he says, yes, he pays the tax. More on that in just a minute. Right? But this is the question. So Peter's confronted with this picture of the main thing. And as I said, in order to understand what's going on here, we've got to see the significance of what this 2 drachma tax was. And this comes out of the Old Testament, of course. This comes out of Exodus chapter 30. And I want to give you 7 things that you should know about the 2 drachma tax, not because that's going to change your life, knowing about the 2 drachma tax, but because you're going to see why this was a picture of the main thing that will help you then make sure that everything is weighed against the main thing. So let's look at this. In Exodus chapter 30, what we see is that this 2 drachma tax, also known as the census tax or the temple tax, was instituted in the law of Moses. So it was a requirement. It was something that all Jewish adults they were obligated to pay this tax. And the details of initially, if you know Jewish history, so they came out of Egypt, and they're going to build the tent of meeting under the leadership of Moses, and so they're given great detail about how to build the tent of meeting, and then great detail about how the specifics of that place of worship was to be executed. And so the upkeep of the tent of meeting, all of those things were a part of the book of Exodus. And later, when Solomon was the king, years later, then he built the temple that replaced the tent of meeting. But the 2 drachma tax or the temple tax was carried through to that, still considered part of the law of Moses. So along with the construction and upkeep of the temple, it's written in here that this 2 drachma tax was to be paid. And number 2, we see it was a religious tax levied against all adult Jews. So if you know that during the time of Jesus on earth, Rome was the world power, and they ruled over this area in Palestine, in Jerusalem and Palestine, and this area of the world as well. And you know, if you know, they ruled with an iron fist. They were very overbearing in their oversight of the peoples that they had conquered. But they did allow religious freedom, and so for the Jews, they were allowed to continue to worship in the temple. And so this 2 drachma tax was a part of that. But Rome wasn't the one instituting it. Rome wasn't the one who was enforcing the 2 drachma tax. It was a religious tax. And though Rome wasn't enforcing that tax, every self-respecting Jew knew that it was their responsibility to pay it because it's a part of the law of Moses. Other thing, number 3, we got to know that it was an annual tax. And this is something that we understand with regard to the Old Testament. So much of the regulations and requirements were things that had to go on over and over and over again. And it was partly to help the people recognize that until this requirement was fully fulfilled, that was completely fulfilled in the one who was promised to come in Messiah, until that was finally and fully fulfilled, that it was something that it was a reminder to them that they had this obligation. And so this annual tax was an obligation that they had to satisfy every single year, reminding them of what it meant, which we'll talk about what it meant here in just a moment. But it was for those under the law of Moses, it was only ever temporarily satisfied. It was never fully and completely satisfied. Every year they had to pay the tax. Number 4, it was the same for all people. So every adult had to pay. If they were rich, they had to pay 2 drachmas. If they were poor, they had to pay 2 drachmas. That was the way it was. Okay? So same for all. Number 5, it was for the support of the temple. Now, so by this tax, then the general work and upkeep of the temple was maintained. That's how they kept it up. And yet here, in order to grasp that, in order to recognize that, this is not like here in America where there's 75 church facilities in one town. And every group of people who says, well, we're going to follow Jesus with this local church, and this is what we're going to do. And of course, there's a facility usually to that, and so people give their offerings and pay their tithes to make sure the lights can turn on and the ministry of the church can function. That's not what this is like here, right? For the nation of Israel, there's one temple. Initially, one tent of meeting, one temple, and this was the hub of their entire lives. As a theocracy with God ruling over them, this tax is what supported their very the very lifeblood of their society, right? So individually and collectively, it was by means of this tax that they maintained their connection to God. So it wasn't just this, it's this little side thing, this 2 drachma tax that everybody has to pay, and it kind of keeps the temple up. No, this is their lifeblood. The temple is what made them the nation of Israel, right? And so it was for the support of the temple. Now we're going to start drilling down, seeing what it really was about. Number 6, it was called the Lord's offering. Exodus chapter 30, it's called the Lord's offering, and they were told that by giving this offering, the Lord's offering, they were, quote, making atonement for their lives. Now, atonement is a major biblical theme that it'd be difficult to reduce down to a couple of sentences to understand it. But if you will, atonement is about human beings who have been alienated from God because of the things that they have done that are contrary to the ways of God. The Bible calls that sin. And the Bible says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that the wages of sin is death, alienation, disconnection from God. So, in giving the Lord's offering here, they were making atonement for their own lives, right? And again, this is symbolic. It's a picture of the main thing. It's not the main thing. It's a picture of the main thing that was temporarily satisfied, but later in the person and work of Jesus Christ, fully and completely satisfied. So we'll get there in just a moment. But this idea of atonement has to do with reconciliation. We're alienated from God because of sin, but when atonement is made for us, those sins are covered and rubbed out, and we are made, if you will, at one, atonement, at one with God. Atonement is necessary for reconciliation. If you're estranged from God because of sin, your sin has to be rubbed out, wiped out, covered, and then you can be made at one with God. You can be reconciled to God. So atonement was absolutely required. So this tax, friends, is not just like this, you pay a toll. And, like the other day I was out visiting some extended family out on the peninsula, and I came back and I crossed the Narrows Bridge. Well, I grew up down in Pierce County. The Narrows Bridge when I was a kid was just a bridge. Now it's a toll bridge. I didn't know that, so a couple of days later, I got a bill in the mail for $7 because I didn't have my good-to-go pass or whatever it's supposed to be. I'm like, okay, I'm going to pay the $7. Who cares, right? Too bad. This 2 drachma tax is not like that little toll that I had to pay. This was their very connection to God. It was called the Lord's offering because by it they made atonement for God. Now, number 7, it was considered the ransom price for each person's life. If you're not familiar with ransom To ransom something is to deliver or to redeem by a substitute. So remember what we talked about. Two things we got to keep in mind. Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. How does he fulfill them? That's that text out of Mark 10. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So how does he fulfill the law and the prophets? By giving his life as a ransom for many. And here we have this symbolic picture of what's going on in the 2 drachma tax. It's called the ransom price for each person's life. So by giving this required offering, the people were making an exchange, the money for their lives. That's what it was. They're making an exchange. They're ransoming their own lives by giving this 2 drachma tax. Right? It was all symbolic, but nevertheless important and required. Right? So this is how the 2 drachma tax is to be seen as a picture of the main thing. So now let's make sure, before we move into our very last point that ties it all together, we recognize, right? Okay, this text is about death and taxes, kind of. It's actually about the main thing, which Jesus discloses is the gospel. And Peter now gets this picture of what the main thing is through this odd little scenario of these religious people trying to collect the 2 drachma tax. Now, let's go to our last section. We get into the second part of verse 25 and through verse 27 where Jesus, here it is, number 3, Jesus teaches a lesson about everything. First, he discloses the main thing. Peter gets a picture of what that main thing is. And now Jesus teaches a lesson about everything. And it starts with a question. And we've got to see the comedy of this, right? So, second part of verse 25. And when Simon Peter comes into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. And you're like, Matthew does not add that just as a random fact, right? We're supposed to see that. We're supposed to pause and go, oh, interesting. Why does he have that in there? Why does Jesus go up to Peter and talk to him first? It seems that good old Simon Peter has spoken out of turn again. Seems that he's spoken about something that he's not quite sure about, but he said it with confidence. Does your teacher not pay the tax? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And then he comes into the house, and Jesus asks him a question, right? So he starts with asking a question. And again, I think that there's got to be some humor in that because we're getting to know this character, Peter, who becomes this great pillar in the early church and the apostle, and he's a great leader and he's all that. But he's a guy. He's a regular old human being who sometimes says things that he shouldn't say and sometimes does things that he shouldn't do. And Jesus is here to help him realize it, right? And to help him along. He begins with this question. What do you think, Simon? This was a common rabbinic strategy to teach. Ask a question. Let people think. Let people ponder. And he asks this question in the form of a very simple parable. Here's the question. From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? Peter probably had to stop for a moment and go, that's a good question, Lord. Let me think about that for a minute. From their sons or from others? Now for us, we probably do have to think about that for a minute because we don't live in that context of kings and royalty and all of that. We live in a representative republic where everybody's supposed to live under the law and nobody's supposed to be above the law and everybody's supposed to be subject to the same laws. Supposed to be. That's a different subject. But that's our context, and so we don't know what it's like for royalty, but for Peter, the question has an obvious answer. He doesn't have to think very, very hard about this. Of course, the kings of the earth, if there's a royal king and he's ruling over a particular area of the world and a particular citizenry, of course he's going to enforce tolls and taxes because that's what keeps the kingdom going. But from whom does he take these tolls and taxes? From whom does he collect them? Of course, the answer is not from his own family, his own family, by virtue of belonging to the king, are exempt. Super simple illustration. My wife, Jessie, she's so great. Isn't she great? She's wonderful. I've known her since I was 11. We actually, got together, started dating, got married right away after high school. I was 19. She was 20. And even when I was a teenager, I had back problems. And so I had to see a chiropractor on a fairly regular basis. And as long as I see a chiropractor fairly regularly, like once or twice a month, I'm like, that's good maintenance for me. And I'm like, I can do a lot of things. But if I don't see him, I'm pretty much crippled, if that's an appropriate word. Sometimes I say things I'm not supposed to say. But when I got married to Jessie, it came with benefits because her dad was a chiropractor. And I was like, now that's not why I'm marrying you, just so you know, but this is a good benefit. Yeah, Bill was a great guy, and he charged people for his services. But he had 4 daughters, a wife, and now having some sons-in-law, and then grandchildren, and later great-grandchildren. He had quite a group of people that weren't paying a dime. I saw Bill for years before we moved out of the area, free, because he didn't charge his own family. Well, this is kind of the same thing, right? Of course, kings of the earth do not collect taxes from their own family members. They're exempt by virtue of having belonged to the king. And Peter notes this is the correct answer. So Jesus asks the question. The question has an obvious answer, but let's keep going. His answer has an obvious point. And here's the point. Just as the sons of the kings of the earth are exempt from the taxes imposed by their fathers, so Jesus, as the Son of God, is exempt from paying the temple tax, which was the house of God. Jesus was not obligated to the temple tax because he's the Son of God. Remember, Peter's the one who identified him as that. Who do people say that I am? Others people say, well, you're a prophet, you're this, you're that. Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, Peter, you didn't come up with that on your own. My Father revealed that to you. And now he's making an additional connection. He's the Son of God. He's not obligated to the 2 drachma tax for the temple. You see it? It's an obvious point, but let's keep going. His point includes a larger lesson. When you get to verse 27, it starts with the word however. And that word is the key to understanding what's going on in this passage. It's not just about death and taxes. This is not about, well, Jesus paid his tax, so you're obligated to pay your taxes too. There's other passages of Scripture that tell people that they should pay their taxes. But this isn't one of them. That's not a conclusion that you can draw from this text and having rightly interpreted it. That's not what's going on. The however is key to understanding the whole thing. That though Jesus is not obligated to pay the temple tax, he does so anyway, rather than allowing that to become an obstacle to the way for people to get to the main thing, the gospel. He does not want people to be unnecessarily offended by everything or anything because of the main thing. You see it? He doesn't want that. His main concern is keeping a clear path to the gospel. So then he sends Peter on this fishing expedition in order to satisfy this tax that he wasn't obligated to pay. And the lesson, of course, is our big idea. Everything has to be weighed against the main thing. If the main thing is the main thing, then everything else can be kept in perspective. And for Jesus, in this text, even though he was not obligated to pay the temple tax, he did it anyway for the sake of the gospel. And that's important for us to grasp, friends. We could say it like this: our rights need to be weighed against our gospel responsibilities. And if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, by virtue of having, through his suffering, death, and resurrection, been brought from death to life, by virtue of having been brought from death to life and gifted with eternal life and brought into the eternal family of God, by virtue of that, you have also been given the ministry of reconciliation. You are a gospel partner with Jesus Christ, and you have gospel responsibilities. And everything else in life has to be weighed against that. And that's the point of this text. And let me clarify. When I say weighed against, it does not mean that it is an automatic, well, I guess I'm just supposed to surrender my rights for the sake of the gospel in every way. That's not what this text says. That's not what I'm saying. This takes a lot of humility. It takes wisdom from God. It takes true surrender to make sure that it's not our will that we're wanting to be done, but God's will to be done. It's not automatic that we surrender our rights. So we've got to exercise that wisdom and that humility that only can come from God because we're truly surrendered to him. But the gospel is the most important thing, right? So how do we weigh everything in life against the gospel? That's what we got to make application to, right? So let's wrap this up, right? Death and taxes, the two supposed certainties in life. But now let's remember the two things we're supposed to keep in mind as we work through the text. Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets, not to abolish, but to fulfill, and he did so by coming and giving his life as a ransom for many. So in keeping with our text, we could say it like this: Jesus fulfilled the requirements of the law regarding the ransom tax by giving his life as a ransom for all. Okay? And the temporal representation of the ransom payment for our lives was that temple tax. But the full and final payment for the ransom payment of our lives is the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is why Matthew connects Jesus' prediction of his death to him paying the temple tax. Okay? So that's the main thing, friends. The main thing is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we are to weigh everything in life against the main thing. That's where we make sure. So think for just a moment. Now, like I said, let's wrap this up. Think about things that are going on in your life right now that are important to you. And I'm not saying they're not important. They are important. Are they so important that you are willing to offend somebody and block their way to the gospel? Are they that important? Are they so important that you yourself are offended and keeping yourself from the gospel? See, friends, everything has to be weighed against the main thing. Whatever else is going on in life, it's not the main thing. Not really. Not if we're thinking clearly. So that's our challenge today. Right? May God help us. May God help us to make sure that everything that's going on in life, our interactions with our neighbors, our coworkers, our family, all throughout our lives, we're going to encounter opportunities to make things that aren't the main thing. And we got to be really careful at that. We got to be really careful at that point, because if we forget what the real main thing is, we end up creating obstacles to it for ourselves and for others. And friends, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. So let's go ahead and find some ways to make some application here. Let's bow in prayer, and let me challenge you with a few thoughts. What in your life is the main thing? If you're a follower of Christ, it's supposed to be the gospel. So what in your life is the main thing? And if it's not the gospel, we're going to receive communion in just a moment. And let this time of communion be an opportunity for you to reorient yourself so that the main thing is the main thing. Where for you can you be more careful with your rights so as not to create any obstacles for the gospel for others? That's what Jesus is concerned about here by paying a tax he's not obligated to. So where for you can you be more careful with your rights? Is there a situation in your life right now that this message has brought clarity to? And I would challenge you to say, make a decision about that. Right this moment, you probably know the right thing to do. So make a decision to do that before your thinking gets clouded again. And maybe lastly, are there any offenses in your own soul that are keeping you from the gospel, that are keeping you from that main thing? And I'm not talking about your eternal salvation at that moment, but just sometimes things can happen in life that we get sidetracked by or that anger us or make us sad, and they create little obstacles in our at-one-ment with God. We're not maintaining our sweet fellowship with Him because we're offended or whatever.